August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal Island, Solomon Islands. Major William Stivers stood at the edge of the jungle, staring at what should have been impossible. 48 hours ago, this had been nothing but dense tropical forest, tangled vines, and mud that could swallow a man to his waist. Now, stretched before him like a miracle of modern engineering, lay a fully operational airstrip capable of handling fighters and bombers. The sound of a wildcat fighter roaring overhead confirmed what his eyes could barely believe. They had done it. But rewind those 48 hours, and the situation had looked utterly hopeless. When the Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, they had one critical objective beyond securing the beachhead. They needed an airfield. Not eventually, not in weeks or months, immediately. Japanese bombers from Rabaul were only hours away, and without air cover, the invasion fleet and the 15,000 Marines on that beach would be sitting ducks. The problem was brutal in its simplicity. The Pacific Islands were covered in jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The ground was either rock-hard, coral, or sucking mud that turned to soup. In the daily tropical downpours, traditional airfield construction took months, required massive equipment, and needed thousands of tons of materials. The Marines had days at best, limited equipment, and an enemy that would bomb them into oblivion the moment they realized Americans were building an airstrip. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Woods, the aviation engineer tasked with this impossible mission, stood on that beach and felt the weight of those 15,000 lives pressing down on him. His men were already unloading bulldozers from the landing craft, but he knew the terrible math. Even if they worked around the clock, even if the Japanese didn't interfere, even if the weather held, there was no way to clear jungle, level ground, and create a stable runway surface in time. Then he remembered something he'd read in an engineering journal before the war. A British invention. Steel planking. Perforated steel planking, to be precise. But could it possibly work in conditions like this? The material was called Marston mat, named after the small North Carolina town where it had been developed and tested. Each section was a rectangle of steel, 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, punched through with holes to reduce weight and allow drainage. The sections interlocked like a massive jigsaw puzzle, and in theory, could be laid directly over prepared ground to create an instant runway surface. In theory. No one had ever tried to use it in combat. No one had ever tested it in jungle conditions. No one had ever attempted to build an entire airfield with it under enemy fire in less than 2 days. But Woods had no choice. It was Marston mat or death. The work began immediately. While some Marines pushed inland to secure a perimeter, engineer battalions attacked the jungle with a fury born of desperation. Bulldozers roared through the undergrowth, their drivers working in shifts, because the heat and humidity made it impossible to operate for more than an hour without collapsing. Trees that had stood for centuries were toppled in minutes. Vines thick as a man's arm were torn away. The jungle fought back with insects, snakes, and terrain that seemed designed by malevolent gods to resist any human effort. Behind the bulldozers came grading crews, trying to create something approximating level ground. The coral was too hard, the mud too soft. It rained twice that first day, turning the workspace into a swamp. Men slipped and fell, equipment bogged down, and the timeline that had seemed impossible now looked fantastical. But Woods drove them on, because overhead, Japanese reconnaissance planes were circling. They knew something was happening. It was only a matter of time before the bombers came. 24 hours in, they began laying the Marston mat. The steel sections came off the supply ships in bundles, each one requiring for men to carry. The work was backbreaking, monotonous, and absolutely critical. Each section had to be perfectly aligned with the next. The interlocking edges fitted precisely, or the entire surface would buckle and tear under the weight of landing aircraft. The men worked through the second night by the light of shielded lanterns, knowing that every light was a beacon for Japanese bombers. They worked through air raid alerts, dropping the steel and diving for cover as enemy planes passed overhead. They worked through another tropical downpour that should have halted everything but instead just made the men more miserable. As they wrestled slippery steel in ankle-deep mud, Private First Class Robert Chen would later describe it as the most surreal experience of the war. He was laying steel planking in a jungle, on an island he'd never heard of before last week, building an airstrip that couldn't possibly be finished in time, while Japanese bombers tried to kill him. The absurdity of it should have been crushing. Instead, it was galvanizing. Every section of Marston Mat they locked into place was a small victory against impossible odds. 40 hours in, they had 1,500 feet of runway completed. It wasn't enough. Fighters needed at least 2,000 feet to land safely, preferably more with full fuel and ammunition loads. But the steel kept coming off the ships, and the men kept laying it down, section by section, foot by foot. Woods walked the length of the runway at hour 43, checking the surface. The Marston mat had held up better than he dared hope. The perforations allowed rainwater to drain through. Instead of pooling on the surface, the interlocking design distributed weight effectively, even over the soft spots in the underlying ground. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't win any engineering awards, but it might actually work. 46 hours after the first Marines hit the beach, the runway measured 2,100 feet. Woods made the call. They were opening for business. He radioed the fleet, still lingering offshore despite the constant threat of Japanese attack. Henderson Field is operational. Send us aircraft. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Henderson Field, they'd already named it, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, named a runway that hadn't existed 2 days ago. 48 hours and 10 minutes after the invasion began, a Marine F-4F Wildcat fighter approached Guadalcanal from the south. The pilot, Captain John Smith, could see the runway from 5 miles out, a brown scar cutting through the green jungle. Impossibly straight, impossibly new. He circled once, checking for obstacles, then committed to the approach. On the ground, hundreds of Marines lined both sides of the runway, many of them the same men who had laid the Marston mat. They watched in silence as the Wildcat descended, its engine roaring, its wheels reaching for the steel surface. The landing gear touched down with a metallic clang that echoed across the island. The Wildcat bounced once, twice, then rolled smoothly down the runway, the Marston mat holding firm under its weight. Smith brought the fighter to a stop, killed the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit to find himself surrounded by cheering Marines. Woods felt tears on his face and didn't care who saw them. They had done it. They had turned jungle into an operational airfield in 48 hours. It was impossible, but they had done it anyway. Over the next 6 months, Henderson Field became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force pilots flew from that steel runway to intercept Japanese bomber raids, to escort American bombers to enemy positions, to maintain the air superiority that made the Guadalcanal campaign possible. The Japanese threw everything they had at that runway, bombing it dozens of times, shelling it from warships, but the Marston mat proved nearly indestructible. Bomb craters could be filled and new sections laid in hours. The perforated steel bent but rarely broke. By the time Guadalcanal was secured in February 1943, Henderson Field had been expanded to 3 runways, all surfaced with Marston mat. The technique was replicated across the Pacific, on islands with names that would become legend: Bougainville, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Anywhere the Americans needed an airfield quickly, they brought Marston mat. After the war, military historians would identify Henderson Field as one of the critical turning points of the Pacific campaign. Without it, the Guadalcanal invasion would likely have failed. Without Guadalcanal, the entire island-hopping strategy might have collapsed. The war could have lasted years longer, cost hundreds of thousands more lives, all because of perforated steel planking and men desperate enough to try the impossible. Major Stivers, who survived the war and became a civil engineer in California, kept a single section of Marston mat in his garage until he died in 1987. When his children asked why he kept a piece of rusty steel with holes in it, he would smile and say, "That's the steel that won the Pacific." And in a very real sense, he was right.